My husband's mother said I was too ordinary to be in their family photos. The gold embossed invitation felt heavy in my hands. Eleanor and Richard Montgomery cordially invite you to celebrate 35 years of marriage. The paper itself announced wealth before you even read the words. Are you sure you want me there? I asked Daniel as he loosened his tie after work. Your mother made it clear last time that I wasn't what she had in mind for her only son. Daniel sighed, running his hand through his dark hair, his conflict signal. Olivia, please. It's their anniversary. Of course. She wants you there. You're my wife. What Daniel never understood was that being his wife meant nothing to Eleanor Montgomery. To her, I was the ordinary girl who had somehow trapped her brilliant son. The public school teacher who wore sensible shoes and shopped sales. The woman whose background was, in Eleanor's words, charmingly simple. If only she knew. The night of the party arrived like an approaching storm. The Montgomery estate sprawled before us, Georgian columns illuminated by strategic lighting. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway as valets accommodated the parade of wealth arriving minute by minute. You look beautiful, Daniel whispered, squeezing my hand as we walked up the marble steps. I'd spent 2 weeks' salary on this dress, a modest navy blue A-line with silver accents. My stomach knotted as we entered the grand foyer where Eleanor stood receiving guests. She was resplendent in a crimson gown that probably cost more than my yearly salary, diamonds dripping from her ears and throat. At 62, she still maintained the sharp beauty that had made her a fixture in Boston's elite social circles. Daniel, darling. She air-kissed both his cheeks before her gaze fell on me, her smile tightening. And Olivia, how nice you could make it. She assessed my dress with a dismissive glance. Navy is such a practical choice, isn't it? Almost like a uniform. I forced a smile. Happy anniversary, Eleanor. The house looks stunning. I handed her my gift, a vintage book of poetry I'd found in a small shop, watching as she accepted it with the enthusiasm of someone being handed a used tissue. How thoughtful, she murmured, immediately passing it to a server, without opening it. The photographers will be arriving shortly for family portraits. As she glided away, Daniel squeezed my shoulder. She's just stressed with all the planning. Come on, let's get a drink. The evening progressed like a theater production. Champagne flowed, orchestral music swelled, and the guests, CEOs, old money families, moved through their social choreography with practiced ease. I stood apart, watching my husband circulate through his parents' world with the comfort of someone born to it. Mrs. Montgomery, a photographer, approached Eleanor. We'd like to begin the family portraits on the grand staircase. Eleanor nodded regally. Wonderful. Richard, Daniel, family photos time. She gestured to her husband and son, deliberately ignoring me. Daniel turned, confused. Olivia, come on. That's when Eleanor's voice cut through the ambient chatter, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Oh, Daniel, don't be silly. These are for the society pages. We need the Montgomery family proper. I felt heat rise to my cheeks as several guests turned to look at me. Mother, Daniel began, but she cut him off with practiced charm. Olivia understands, don't you, dear? You're sweet, but a bit too ordinary for the historical record of our family. She laughed lightly, as though she'd made a harmless joke. We have appearances to maintain. Perhaps you could fetch me another champagne while we do this. The silence that followed felt eternal. Several women nearby exchanged glances, some embarrassed, others barely concealing their amusement. I stood frozen, the champagne glass in my hand suddenly feeling like it might shatter in my grip. Daniel's face flushed. Mother, that's completely inappropriate. Olivia is my wife. And these photos are about legacy, Daniel. A Montgomery tradition. Eleanor's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. Now come along. The photographer is waiting, and the just arrived. I watched as Daniel's resolve crumbled under the weight of 35 years of conditioning. He looked at me apologetically. I'll be quick, he murmured. I'm sorry. Then he followed his mother up the staircase, joining his father and extended family members. Not one of them spoke up for my inclusion. I stood alone in the crowded room, invisible yet conspicuous. A server passing by offered to take my empty glass, looking at me with more kindness than anyone else had shown all evening. From across the room, I watched the photographer arrange the Montgomery family. Eleanor at the center, her hand possessively on Daniel's arm. They smiled for the camera, the perfect family portrait that would grace the society pages and Eleanor's carefully curated albums. In that moment, something crystallized inside me. I had been playing a role too. The accommodating wife who never rocked the boat. The woman who kept family secrets, mine and theirs. A strange smile formed on my lips. If Eleanor thought I was ordinary, it was because I had allowed her to believe it. I had chosen love over legacy, simplicity over power. But some choices can be unmade. As the evening continued, I slipped into the quiet of Eleanor's oak-paneled study and removed my phone from my clutch. I dialed a number I hadn't called in months. James? It's Olivia Freeman. I paused, tasting my maiden name again. Yes, it has been a while. I think it's time we discussed my grandfather's estate. All of it. When I returned to the party, I wore the same modest dress, but something had changed. I smiled politely when Eleanor introduced me as Daniel's wife. She teaches elementary school. Isn't that sweet? I nodded graciously when she commented on how budget bridal my dress looked compared to the designer gowns around me. But behind my smile was the beginning of a plan, one that would make Eleanor Montgomery regret the day she decided I was too ordinary for her precious family photos. The ride home from Eleanor's party was silent. Daniel tried several times to apologize, each attempt dying on his lips as I stared out the window. It wasn't just anger that kept me quiet, it was calculation. For the first time in our marriage, I was seeing things clearly. Olivia, I'm sorry about tonight. Mother was completely out of line. Daniel finally managed as we pulled into our modest suburban driveway, a far cry from his parents' estate. I turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. It's fine, Daniel. I'm used to it. His relief at my apparent forgiveness was palpable, but misplaced. Inside our home, the small 3-bedroom we'd chosen because it was sensible, I changed out of my budget bridal dress and into comfortable clothes. Then I pulled out the old leather box I kept tucked away in my closet, behind shoeboxes and winter sweaters where Daniel never looked. Inside were the remnants of a life I'd walked away from. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, and the single key to a safety deposit box I hadn't opened since before our wedding. Daniel knew I'd been raised by my grandfather after my parents died in an accident when I was 8. He knew my grandfather had been comfortable financially. What he didn't know, what I'd never told him, was that Edward Freeman had built one of the largest private technology empires in the country from nothing. That the man who taught me to fish and helped with my science projects had been worth billions. That I'd grown up in a house that made the Montgomery estate look like a starter home. I'd kept it hidden not out of shame, but because I wanted to be loved for myself. I'd seen too many people fawn over my grandfather's money, too many friends who disappeared when I insisted on living independently. When I met Daniel in graduate school, me studying education despite my grandfather's hopes I'd take over the business, him pursuing his MBA, I saw a chance at a normal life with someone who valued me, not my inheritance. My grandfather had respected my choice, though he never understood it. Love is important, Olivia, he'd said the last time I saw him alive, but so is power. Sometimes they're the same thing. I hadn't understood what he meant until tonight, watching Eleanor dismiss me while her son, my husband, stood by. I pulled out my phone and dialed again. James, it's me again. I need you to meet me tomorrow, and bring all the paperwork. James Nelson had been my grandfather's attorney for 30 years, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of what Edward Freeman had built and what he'd left to his only grandchild. We met at a quiet cafe far from any place the Montgomerys might frequent. James, in his immaculate suit, looked exactly as he had at the reading of my grandfather's will a year ago. It's good to see you, Olivia, he said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Though I must admit I was surprised by your call. You were quite adamant about keeping your inheritance quiet. I took a sip of my coffee. Things change. May I ask what's prompted this sudden interest? You haven't touched a penny of the estate in a year. I considered how much to tell him. James had always been discreet, but he was also pragmatic. He'd need to understand my motivation if he was going to help me. Let's just say I've been reminded that in certain circles, being ordinary is the greatest sin. I opened the folder, scanning the list of assets my grandfather had left me. Multiple technology companies, real estate across 3 continents, investment portfolios, all held in trust, managed by Edward's team, growing even without my involvement. And what exactly are you planning to do? James asked carefully. I want to take control. Quietly. I flipped through the pages. My grandfather built this empire from nothing. I think it's time I honored that legacy. James studied me, probably noting the change in my demeanor. I'd always been the granddaughter who rejected wealth for a quiet life. Now I sat straighter, spoke more deliberately. Your grandfather would be pleased, he finally said. He always believed you had it in you. I paused at a particular page, a detailed accounting of the Freeman Holdings banking interests. Tell me, James, does Freeman Holdings still have connections with First National Bank? Of course. Your grandfather owned a significant stake. And how much real estate financing do they handle in Boston's elite circles? A slow smile spread across James's face as he realized where I was going. A considerable amount. The old families often leverage their estates for business ventures. They'd never admit it publicly, of course. Of course not, I echoed. That would be ordinary. I pulled out my phone and showed him a picture I'd taken at Eleanor's party, an award plaque on the wall thanking the Montgomery family for their historic preservation of Oakwood Manor, their ancestral estate. I want everything you can find on the Montgomery estate and business holdings. Property records, bank loans, business partnerships, everything. James's eyebrows rose slightly. May I ask why? Research, I said simply. It's time I educated myself on my husband's family. As we finished our meeting, James handed me a sleek black credit card. Your grandfather's main account. It has remained active as per the terms of the trust. The current balance is... He wrote a number on a slip of paper that made even me pause. Growing up with wealth was one thing. Actually controlling it was another. Will there be anything else, Miss Freeman? The name hit differently now. For 3 years, I'd been Mrs. Montgomery, the ordinary schoolteacher who wasn't good enough for family photos. But before that, I'd been Olivia Freeman, heiress to one of the largest private fortunes in America. Yes, I said, tucking the card into my wallet. I'll need office space, something discreet. And I'll need to be introduced to the board members of Freeman Holdings. As James made notes, I felt a strange sensation, like my grandfather was standing just behind my shoulder, nodding in approval. I had walked away from his legacy once. I wouldn't make that mistake again. One last thing, I added as we stood to leave. Daniel can't know. Not yet. James nodded, understanding perfectly. As your grandfather used to say, the best power moves are the ones they never see coming. For the first time since Eleanor's party, I smiled genuinely. The game had begun, and Eleanor Montgomery had no idea who she was really playing against. 2 weeks after Eleanor's anniversary party, I sat in my newly leased office in downtown Boston, 20 floors above the city streets and a world away from my elementary school classroom. I'd taken a leave of absence. Family emergency. I told my principal, which wasn't entirely untrue. Daniel noticed the change in my schedule, but seemed relieved rather than suspicious. He assumed I needed space after his mother's behavior, and his guilt made him uncharacteristically unquestioning. Working on a special curriculum project, I'd explained vaguely when he asked about my new routine. The lie came easily, surprising me. But then, our entire marriage had been built on my partial truths. My office door opened, and James entered with a thick folder and an expression I was beginning to recognize as his good news face. You were right, he said without preamble. The Montgomery estate, Oakwood Manor, has been mortgaged 3 times in the last decade. The latest refinancing was just 6 months ago. He placed mortgage documents on my desk. They're leveraged to the hilt, Olivia. I scanned the papers, noting the amounts. 22 million on a property assessed at 30. That's risky. Richard Montgomery's business ventures haven't been as successful as the family portrays. They keep up appearances, but they're stretched thin. James looked impressed. How did you know? I thought back to subtle clues. Eleanor's obsessive bragging about the estate's history, the deferred maintenance I'd noticed on my visits, the way they'd stopped using the East Wing. Just a hunch. Well, your hunch was correct. First National is their lender, and they're getting nervous. The Montgomerys have missed 2 payments already. I leaned back in my chair, a plan crystallizing. And Freeman Holdings still owns what percentage of First National? 28%. Not controlling, but significant enough that your voice matters. I smiled. Make an offer through a shell corporation. I want to buy that mortgage. James hesitated. Olivia, that's aggressive. Are you sure you want to? I'm sure.
My voice was firm.
And I want it done quietly. No one can know the buyer is connected to Freeman Holdings. He nodded, making notes. I'll create a suitable entity. Anything else? I slid another folder toward him.
Yes.
I've been researching their business properties. The Montgomery Investment Group leases their headquarters, correct? Yes, from Westland Commercial Properties. I want to buy the building. James blinked. The entire building?
Yes.
It's a good investment, don't you think? I kept my tone casual, though there was nothing casual about my intentions. I'll begin negotiations immediately, James said, adjusting to this new, decisive version of me. At your grandfather's funeral, you said you wanted nothing to do with his business dealings, and now I've realized he was right about many things. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. Eleanor Montgomery called me ordinary, James. Too ordinary for their precious family photos, too ordinary for their legacy. And this is about proving her wrong? I turned, meeting his eyes. This is about justice. And maybe a little poetic irony. 3 weeks later, I held the deed to Oakwood Manor, or rather, Eclipse Holdings did, the shell corporation James had created for me. I also owned the Montgomery Investment Group headquarters through another entity called Freeman Capital Partners. The real estate acquisitions were just the beginning. James had introduced me to my grandfather's board, and I'd surprised everyone by showing up with detailed plans for expanding Freeman Holdings' interests. My years of watching from the sidelines had given me perspectives they hadn't considered. Your grandfather would be proud, remarked Gerard Wells, the CFO who'd worked with Edward for 20 years. You have his instincts. I accepted the compliment with a nod. What I didn't tell him was that those instincts were currently focused on one particular family. At home, I maintained my ordinary life. Daniel and I settled into a new routine, he working long hours at his family firm, me supposedly developing educational materials. We rarely discussed Eleanor, though she called him frequently. One evening, as we ate takeout in our kitchen, Daniel seemed troubled. Everything okay at work? I asked, knowing it probably wasn't.
He sighed.
Strange things are happening. The building management changed hands, and the new owners are raising our rent by 30% when the lease renews next month. I made a sympathetic noise. That's rough. Can your family afford it? Mother's furious. Says we've been in that building for 15 years and deserved better treatment. He rubbed his temples. And there's something else. There are rumors that Oakwood's mortgage was sold. Your family estate? Does that matter? I kept my voice neutral despite the acceleration of my pulse. It shouldn't, but Father seems worried. He had some arrangement with the bank. Daniel looked exhausted. Mother keeps saying people are conspiring against them. If only he knew. Will they need to sell the house? I asked gently. God, no. Daniel looked horrified. That estate has been in the family for generations. Mother would rather die than lose it. I hid my smile behind my wine glass. I'm sure it won't come to that. But it would come close. I'd make sure of it. 2 days later, as the newly anonymous owner of their mortgage, I instructed James to send formal notices about the missed payments. Simultaneously, as their new landlord, I approved renovations to the office building that would conveniently disrupt the elegant entrance to the Montgomery Investment Group. The contractors can only work during business hours, I told James with false regret. Such a shame about the noise and dust. Eleanor's complaints reached me through Daniel's increasingly stressed phone calls with his parents. The construction noise was unbearable. The mortgage situation was harassment. The new property managers were vulgar nouveau riche types with no respect for tradition. They keep asking who's behind these companies. Daniel told me one night. Mother's convinced it's someone with a vendetta. I kissed his cheek. That sounds a bit paranoid, don't you think? He sighed. Maybe. But it is strange how it's all happening at once. Bad luck comes in waves, I offered, gathering our dinner plates. As I loaded the dishwasher, a task Eleanor had once observed with horror, declaring Montgomery women don't do dishes, I reflected on my progress. I was squeezing them financially, eroding their comfort, but it wasn't enough. I wanted Eleanor to feel what I'd felt that night, publicly humiliated, stripped of dignity. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Invitation arrived. Montgomery Harvest Gala, next month at Oakwood. Perfect timing. The annual charity event where Boston's elite gathered at the Montgomery estate, an event Eleanor had conspicuously failed to invite me to for 3 years running. This year would be different. This year, I'd be attending as more than Daniel's ordinary wife. I'd be attending as their landlord. The Montgomery family's carefully constructed facade began crumbling faster than I'd anticipated. Within a month of my acquisitions, the changes were visible even to outsiders. Daniel came home increasingly stressed, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a harried tension I'd never seen before. One evening, he loosened his tie with such force he nearly tore it. They let go 3 people today, he said, pouring himself a scotch, something he rarely did on weeknights. Junior staff, but still. We've never had layoffs before. I set aside the book I'd been reading. That's terrible. Why? Cost-cutting. He drained half his glass. The rent increase is just the beginning. The new property managers are charging for everything, parking, maintenance, even the water service. Father's furious. I made a sympathetic noise. Can't he negotiate? Daniel laughed bitterly. He's tried. The management company just refers him to some corporate office that never returns calls. He didn't know he was describing the carefully constructed buffer I'd established between myself and the Montgomerys. And your mother? I asked, unable to resist. His expression darkened. You know Mother. She's taken it personally, convinced someone's targeting the family specifically. Eleanor wasn't entirely wrong, but her paranoia had exceeded even my expectations. According to Daniel, she'd started compiling lists of potential enemies. Business rivals, social climbers she'd snubbed, even former staff she'd fired. My name, of course, never appeared on her radar. The ordinary schoolteacher couldn't possibly orchestrate something this sophisticated. A week later, I sat in James's office reviewing the latest financial reports on the Montgomery Investment Group. Their cash flow problems had accelerated when I'd instructed the property management company to require a substantial security deposit for their continued tenancy, due, coincidentally, the same week as their mortgage payment. They've requested an extension on the mortgage, James informed me, sliding the formal letter across his desk. Richard Montgomery has asked for a meeting with the new holder of their loan. I smiled. Denied. On both counts. James raised an eyebrow. Olivia, they're offering to pay a penalty for the extension. It would actually be more profitable, too. This isn't about profit, James. He studied me for a moment. You know, your grandfather was ruthless in business, but he never made it personal. Didn't he? I countered. The Westridge takeover? The Cambridge development deal? Those felt pretty personal to me. Fair point, James conceded. But he always gave his opponents a way out, a chance to surrender with dignity. I considered this. My grandfather had indeed been calculating, but never cruel for cruelty's sake. The Montgomerys will have their chance, I said finally, but not until they understand what it feels like to lose control. On my way home, I drove past the Montgomery estate. Even from the road, I could see workers removing the large ornamental urns that had flanked the main entrance for generations. Cost-cutting measures, no doubt. The sight gave me a satisfaction I wasn't entirely comfortable with. That evening, another piece of my plan fell into place. Daniel received a call during dinner, his face growing increasingly pale as he listened. "What do you mean you can't cater it?" The deposit was, he paused, listening. "But the gala is in 3 weeks. You've done it for 20 years. Another pause.
Fine. Yes.
I understand. He hung up and stared at his plate. The caterers canceled for the Harvest Gala. Said they never received the deposit. Couldn't your mother have forgotten to send it? I suggested innocently. Daniel shook his head. Mother handles the gala personally. She would never. He trailed off, doubt creeping into his voice. Though she has been distracted lately. What Daniel didn't know was that Eleanor had indeed sent the deposit to an account that had been mysteriously closed the day before the transfer. The returned funds had been misrouted, a banking error that would be resolved eventually, but not before the caterers had accepted another event for the same date. Can you find another caterer? I asked. 3 weeks before the biggest social event of the season? Everyone's booked. He rubbed his temples. Mother's going to lose her mind. She did more than that. According to Daniel's increasingly frantic calls with his father over the next few days, Eleanor had become nearly unhinged, screaming at staff, firing her assistant of 12 years, and accusing the board members of undermining the family. She's making it worse, Daniel confessed to me after a particularly difficult day. The investors are getting nervous. Father had to talk her out of attending the last board meeting because he was afraid of what she might say. I felt a twinge of something, not quite guilt, but a question about how far I was willing to go. Then I remembered Eleanor's voice, clear as crystal. You're sweet, but a bit too ordinary for the historical record of our family. The memory hardened my resolve. 2 days before the gala, I made my final move in this phase of my plan. After confirming that the Montgomerys had been unable to secure another caterer, I had James reach out through a third party to offer a solution, a prestigious catering company, recently acquired by a Freeman Holdings subsidiary, had a last-minute cancellation and could handle the event. The catch? A significant premium on their already exorbitant fee, payable immediately. The Montgomerys accepted, despite the financial strain. The gala would proceed. There's something else, Daniel told me that night, his voice hesitant. Mother thinks it would be best if you didn't attend the gala this year. Despite expecting this, the words still stung. Because, she says with all the stress and the scaled-back event, it would be better to keep it to immediate family and close business associates. He couldn't meet my eyes. I told her it was ridiculous, but she insisted. I maintained a neutral expression. And what did you say? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I said I'd talk to you about it. 3 years ago. This would have hurt deeply. Now, it was merely the final confirmation I needed. It's fine, I said, reaching for his hand. I understand. The relief on his face should have broken my heart. Instead, it strengthened my determination. Daniel had chosen his side, the same side he always chose. Thank you for understanding, he said, squeezing my hand. It's just this year, with everything going on. I smiled. Of course. I'm sure it will be a night to remember. That, at least, wasn't a lie. The Montgomery Harvest Gala would indeed be memorable, just not in the way any of them expected. Because while Eleanor thought she was keeping me away, I was already making arrangements for my grand entrance, not as Daniel's ordinary wife, but as the woman who now controlled their entire world. The night of the Montgomery Harvest Gala arrived crisp and clear. I stood in my downtown office as James reviewed our final preparations. The press will arrive at 8, he confirmed, all thinking they're covering a major business acquisition announcement. I smoothed my custom Valentino in deep emerald, worth more than our monthly mortgage payment. The diamonds at my ears and throat, my grandfather's gifts, caught the light as I studied my reflection. Gone was the modest schoolteacher. I looked like what I truly was, one of the wealthiest women in Boston. The documents? I asked. James patted his briefcase. Property deeds, mortgage papers, everything proving you control the Montgomery assets. And, Daniel? at the gala with his parents. My husband had left our house in his tuxedo, promising to make it up to me for missing the event. He assumed I'd be grading papers and watching movies. Instead, I'd arranged for a stylist, makeup artist, and my new team to prepare me for my entrance. "Let's go," I said. "I believe I'm late for a family photo." The Montgomery estate blazed with light as we approached. Despite Eleanor's financial troubles, she'd maintained the appearance of opulence. Japanese lanterns hanging from ancient oaks, valets in crisp uniforms, a string quartet playing in the garden. I instructed my driver to pull directly to the front entrance reserved for family. As planned, James had alerted the press, ensuring photographers were positioned perfectly. When I stepped out, cameras flashed. A valet gasped, "Mrs. Montgomery?" I smiled. "Yes, Thomas." The photographers surged forward, calling my name, now introduced as the reclusive CEO of Freeman Holdings. With James beside me, I walked up the marble steps I'd once climbed in my budget bridal dress. This time, heads turned in curiosity rather than dismissal. Inside, I spotted Daniel with his parents near the center of the room. Eleanor was mid-conversation with the mayor's wife. I moved through the crowd, which parted instinctively. Daniel saw me first, his champagne glass freezing halfway to his lips. Recognition and shock crossed his face. "Olivia?" Eleanor turned, her expression changing from confusion to alarm as she registered both my presence and appearance. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, maintaining her society smile. Daniel explained we're keeping it intimate this year. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied with matching insincerity. "After all, this is a special night." Flashbulbs erupted as the photographers I'd invited entered, followed by business reporters and prominent board members, all my personal guests. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded as cameras focused on us. "This is a private event." "Is it?" I asked pleasantly. I wasn't aware homeowners needed permission to host gatherings on their own property. A confused murmur ran through the nearby guests. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor snapped, her composure slipping. "This estate has been in the Montgomery family for generations." James opened his briefcase and handed me a document. "Actually, Eleanor, Oakwood Manor belongs to Eclipse Holdings." I held up the deed, as does the building housing Montgomery Investment Group and the controlling interest in your family business. The color drained from Eleanor's face. Richard swayed slightly. Daniel stared at me as though seeing a stranger. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Who is behind Eclipse Holdings?" "I am," I said simply. "Or rather, Freeman Holdings is my grandfather Edward Freeman's company." Recognition dawned in Richard's eyes. "Edward Freeman? The tech billionaire?" I nodded. "My grandfather. He left everything to me when he died." I turned to Eleanor. "I'm afraid I'm not as ordinary as you thought." The room went silent, every guest straining to hear. Reporters scribbled frantically as photographers captured Eleanor's stunned expression. "You can't do this," she managed finally. "I didn't take anything," I corrected her. "I purchased it legally when your family over-leveraged themselves to maintain appearances." I stepped closer. "You should have invited me to the family photos, Eleanor." Daniel finally spoke. "Olivia, what have you done?" I saw the betrayal in his eyes. Not for what I'd done to his family, but because I'd kept secrets from him. We were more alike than different. We'd both chosen family loyalty over honesty. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced at the gathering, "as the new owner of this estate, I welcome you to what will now be known as the Freeman Foundation Autumn Benefit, supporting education for underprivileged children." Applause erupted from the confused but entertained guests. The wealthy always appreciated a good power play. Eleanor's face contorted with rage. "You planned this all along. You married my son for—" "I married your son because I loved him," I interrupted. "I hid my wealth because I wanted to be loved for myself. A concept you've never understood, Eleanor." As I walked away, I felt 3 pairs of eyes burning into my back. Eleanor's filled with hatred, Richard's with defeat, and Daniel's with a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't identify. The ordinary wife was gone. In her place stood Olivia Freeman, heir to a fortune, and now the owner of everything the Montgomerys had once held dear. 3 weeks after the gala, autumn had fully settled over Boston. The leaves in the garden of Oakwood Manor, now officially renamed Freeman Estate, turned brilliant shades of red and gold. I sat on the terrace, tea steaming in the crisp air, watching workers replace the Montgomery family crest above the main entrance with a simple, elegant F. The aftermath of my revelation had been swift and merciless, not by my design, but by the nature of high society itself. The same people who had smiled at Eleanor for decades now avoided her calls. The board members who had deferred to Richard now voted him out of his chairmanship. The friends who had snubbed me at Eleanor's instruction now sent me invitations and gift baskets. Loyalty, I discovered, was as rare in their world as true wealth. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Final papers ready for signatures. Montgomery bankruptcy proceedings complete. I hadn't intended for them to go bankrupt. I'd simply removed my financial support and called in their debts, actions that revealed just how precarious their position had been all along. The house of cards Eleanor had maintained through sheer force of will had collapsed spectacularly. Mrs. Freeman? My new assistant approached with a silver tray. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery are here. I nodded, setting down my tea. Show them out. Eleanor and Richard appeared moments later, both looking diminished. Eleanor had lost weight, her designer outfit hanging slightly loose. Richard's shoulders stooped in a way I'd never seen before. Neither had expected to be meeting me at what had been their home for 30 years. Thank you for coming, I said, not rising. Please sit. They sat stiffly in the chairs across from me. The garden where we'd once been photographed, minus me, stretched behind them. We've reviewed your offer, Richard said, his voice formal as though addressing a business associate rather than his daughter-in-law. It's generous. More than fair, I agreed. The guest house has been completely renovated. You can move in immediately if you'd like, or take time to find alternative accommodations. Eleanor's jaw tightened. You expect us to live in our own servants' quarters? To pay you rent? Former servants' quarters, I corrected. And yes, that's one option. The other is to leave with the settlement I've offered and start over elsewhere. Richard placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm. We'll take the settlement. Eleanor jerked away from him. How can you accept this? She manipulated her way into our family, hid her background, and systematically destroyed everything we built. I leaned forward. I married your son because I loved him. I hid my background because I wanted to be loved for myself, something you never understood. As for destroying what you built, I gestured to the estate around us. You were doing that just fine without my help. The mortgages, the loans, the corners cut to maintain appearances, that was all you. Where is Daniel? Richard asked quietly, clearly trying to defuse the tension. We haven't heard from him since the night I revealed I wasn't quite as ordinary as you thought. I finished for him. He's traveling, considering his options. The night of the gala, Daniel had followed me home in silence. In our kitchen, the modest kitchen in our modest house that suddenly seemed like a prop in a play, he'd finally spoken. Were you ever going to tell me? He'd asked, his voice hoarse. About your grandfather, the money, any of it? Were you ever going to stand up to your mother for me? I'd countered. We'd looked at each other across the kitchen island, two people who had kept essential parts of themselves hidden. Two people who had chosen loyalty to their respective families over complete honesty with each other. I need time, he'd finally said, packing a bag and leaving that night. He's considering divorce, I assume, Eleanor said, bringing me back to the present. He's considering many things, I replied evenly. As am I. The truth was more complicated. Daniel had called daily since leaving, his initial anger giving way to confusion, then to a strange kind of respect. Last night, he'd asked to come home. Not to our old house, but to Freeman Estate. I hadn't given him an answer yet. The settlement papers, Richard prompted, clearly eager to end this meeting. I slid the folder across the table. Everything's prepared. Once signed, the funds will be transferred immediately. Eleanor stared at the papers, then at me. You think you've won? This was never a competition, Eleanor. It was a correction. I met her gaze steadily. You decided I wasn't good enough to stand beside your son in a photograph. I decided to show you exactly who I am. After they signed, my staff escorted them out. I watched from the terrace as they walked to their car, the last time they would leave this property as anything but visitors. As their car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a presence behind me. That can't have been easy, Daniel said softly. I turned to face my husband. He looked tired but resolute, his suitcase at his feet. Neither was watching you follow your mother up those stairs when she humiliated me, I replied. Neither was hiding who I really am for 3 years. I know. He stepped closer. I've spent weeks thinking about that night, about all the times I should have stood up for you, but didn't, about what kind of man that makes me. I said nothing, waiting. I loved you when you were a schoolteacher. I love you now. He hesitated. But I need to know who I'm married to. All of her, not just the parts she chooses to show me. And I need a husband who stands beside me, not behind his mother. Daniel nodded slowly. I think we both have changes to make. I gestured to his suitcase. You're staying? If you'll have me. Not because of all this. He gestured to the estate around us, but in spite of it. Because underneath the schoolteacher and underneath the heiress is the woman I want to build a life with. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen slightly. We had a long way to go, but perhaps there was a path forward. The East Wing has been renovated, I said. We can start there. As the sun set over what was now my estate, I thought of my grandfather and his words about love and power. Perhaps he had been right, sometimes they were the same thing. But power without love was hollow, as Eleanor had discovered. And love without respect was unsustainable, as Daniel and I had learned. I had become the queen of a castle I never wanted, to prove a point to a woman who had underestimated me. Now I needed to decide what to do with that power, and whether my marriage could survive in its shadow.